A homeless gentleman by the name of Henry Miller spent over 17 years wandering the busy streets of New York City, subjected to daily humiliation and rejection from a society that viewed him as nothing more than a liability. The made sign of cardboard, all weathered by time and the elements, said, "Used to be someone," laying there on the ground true, but people passing would not find the story to those words that called out the life they never knew. But then, everything changed on one fateful afternoon when he was lying on his regular bench and a black SUV pulled next to him, and a well-groomed man got out. This moment would connect Henry's life to both his past and his future. What sinister secret lurked behind what was written on his cardboard sign that day, and how was the arrival of the black SUV about to turn it all upside down? Hang tight, and before we get started, tell us where you're watching this from today, and if you like this story, please subscribe. On one side of the busy New York City shopping center area stood Henry Miller, a 62-year-old homeless man. In his thin frame and sunken eyes was the story of days without food. His once bulky frame had become skin and bones. In his shaking hands was a cardboard sign that said, "Used to be someone." The irony in those words wasn't lost on him as Henry stood on that sidewalk, mere feet away from a steady stream of people of all ages who looked right through him and couldn't see his sorrowful eyes in the slightest as they hurried past him, hoping that one of them might turn away from the glass-covered buildings with the big dollar signs on them, long enough to spare him an extra $1. A well-put-together man approached, and for one fleeting moment Henry's spirits rose. Could someone here be his salvation? But as the man approached, a sneer formed across his face. "Used to be someone, huh?" the man sneered, his voice full of contempt. "Someone like you used to be someone, I doubt. You loser." A cruel laugh and a kick sent Henry's begging cup flying across the sidewalk, scattering the few coins he had collected. Henry watched in dismay as the one means that kept him eating rolled away, some plopping into nearby storm drains, others wedging between cracks in the pavement. Laughing rang in Henry's ear as he hobbled down to the ground, his crippled joints wailing in resistance. His vision had declined significantly, and thus the finding of the coins scattered about the arena became even more difficult. He groped, his fingers searching for the cold metal discs. The man's taunts taunting him continued. "Look at you crawling around like a pathetic worm," the man mocked. "This is where you belong, in the gutter with the rest of the trash." Henry forced the cruel words from his mind and focused on getting what little he had. It took several miserable minutes before he was able to gather up most of the coins. When he was done, the man had already turned and walked off, leaving Henry with the words still stinging in his ears and his bones creaking. Understanding that this place would not be kind, Henry gathered his scant belongings and set off walking. Each step he took was slow and unsteady, a reminder of how much he had fallen. Walking down the sidewalk, he passed by a hot dog stand. The smell of grilled meat made his empty stomach growl painfully. Summoning what was left of his courage, Henry stepped up to the vendor. "Sorry," he said, in a voice that was little more than a whisper. "Do you have any leftovers?" "Anything at all, I have a little money." He extended his hand to display the few coins he had managed to gather so far. The hot dog vendor hardly looked at Henry's outstretched hand before waving him off. "Not enough," he grunted, "and I don't serve your kind. You're driving. My customer's away. Get lost." Disconsolate, Henry retreated from the stand, his dry throat sore, a reminder of his thirst. Making his way to a nearby water fountain, he was thankful for at least this small mercy. As Henry leaned to drink from the fountain, he felt the presence of someone beside him. A young mother was standing next to him, with her toddler son by the hand. The boy was holding a water bottle, sitting there waiting for his turn at the fountain. Henry sat up straight and wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. He attempted a smile at the young boy, lifting his hand in a slight wave. "Hello, there, little friend," he said gently. But the mother reacted quickly and severely. She pulled her son back, her face twisted with revulsion. "Do not look at him, sweetie," she hissed loud enough for Henry to hear. "Come on, we'll get your bottle filled somewhere else." The mother rushed away with her child, and Henry's shoulders sagged down even more. He'd long ago lost track of how many times he'd been treated as a monster, something to be feared and avoided. But it never got easier. Having quenched his thirst somewhat, Henry made his way across the street, his gaze drawn to a park he could see in the distance. The seductive whisper of a shaded bench beckoned him, the brief relief of the hot sun and even hotter glares of passers-by. Henry sighed heavily as he sat on the cool wooden slats of the bench. He watched the world, joggers, dog walkers, families out for a stroll, life that he could hardly remember living. That the game would go on in this manner was a sick joke, a reminder of everything he'd lost. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of children laughing and playing nearby. He looked over and saw a bunch of kids, likely on a school trip, pointing at him. "Why is that man so ugly?" one child asked loudly. "He lives on the street," another one said. "My father says only insane people do so." A third child, more daring than the others, said, "Should we scare him? I bet he'd run away." Before the children could act on their cruel impulses, their teacher saw what was happening. She hurried the group away, but not before casting Henry a look of utter revulsion, the kind she might have given someone who was about to contaminate her charges just by being there. Years ago, those encounters might have left Henry feeling angry or broken-hearted, but now he felt nothing. Nothing terrified him more than the dawning recognition that he had grown so numb to humiliation. No harsh word or quizzical glance would ever scare him more. The sun was rising and light illuminated the park, and Henry was once again wondering how much longer he could tolerate living like this. What was the sense of even going one more day? Each day was pain, rejection. The world had told him that it had no place for him, no use for a broken-down old man with nothing to give. Tears started to fall, silent drops that traced lines in the filth on his cheeks. Henry bent in on himself, his chin dropping toward his chest, crushed under the weight of his own sorrow. Henry Miller was sitting on a park bench, surrounded by the bustle of life going on around him. Yet for that awful moment he felt absolutely and utterly alone. Drowning in despair, Henry was slumped on the park bench when another sound pierced the background hum of the city. A soft strum of guitar strings wafted through the midday air, pulling his attention from his woes. Henry looked up. His tear-streaked eyes scanned to find the source of the music. A few blocks from his bench, a young man was setting up a small performance area, an acoustic guitar slung on a strap around his neck, and he was messing with a portable speaker. An open guitar case lay at his feet, awaiting donations from any fans of his music. Curiosity getting the better of him, Henry observed as the young musician completed his preparations. A few chords rang out clearly, and Henry experienced a jolt of recognition. He recognized the melody. It was an old favorite of his youth. By the time the song wound down, Henry was mouthing the lyrics in sync with the singer. "He used to be someone," he said quietly. He did not miss the irony of the title. The lyrics about lost identity and faded glory rang true, very true, in Henry's current state of affairs. The song pulled him back into another time, another life. He recalled hearing this very song on the radio while driving to work, humming it while doing chores around the house, even singing it to his young son as a lullaby. Those memories, long staking themselves deep beneath the weight of years of suffering and hopelessness, floated to the top, bringing a bittersweet ache. As the last notes reverberated through the room, Henry experienced something he had not felt in close to a decade, a real bond to another human, albeit one via a common love of sound. On impulse, he stood up from the bench and walked up to the young musician, reached into his pocket. Henry reached for one of his precious dollar bills. It was wrinkled and worn, just like Henry himself, but it was all he had to give. He put the bill in the open guitar case with a trembling hand. "Keep it, son," Henry replied, voice thick with feeling. "You've brought life to my soul, whether it was for a minute." The young musician looked up, surprise on his face. He didn't expect a donation from someone who so plainly had little to give. "Thank you, sir," he said with sincerity. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." A ghost of a smile flitted across Henry's weathered face and he nodded. For that moment he felt like a human being, not the nameless, faceless, homeless man he had become. But it didn't last. The weight of his reality settled back on his shoulders as he turned away from the musician. As the sun rose toward its zenith, Henry's stomach twisted painfully in reminder he had yet to eat since morning. He remembered a back alley behind a local supermarket where he sometimes came across discarded, but still edible food. Not great, but better than starving. His footsteps weighed him down as Henry walked across the park and into the street. The city surrounding him throbbed at midday rush. Storefronts packed, the crowd flowing purposefully past him. Moving. Through the crowds, Henry walked as though he were a ghost, unseen as he passed the bright, busy day. Henry's hopes for a meal dashed when he reached the alley. Another homeless man was already there, elbow deep in the dumpster, looking for anything he could use. Henry hesitated, reluctant to provoke a territorial dispute when he was at such low an ebb. He knew he wouldn't hold up well if it came to blows. As Henry stood at the mouth of the alley, unsure what to do or where to go, the back door of the supermarket flew open. The store manager, fuming, stormed out, red in the face. "Get the fuck out of here, you dirty bum," the manager yelled, charging toward the man at the dumpster. "How many times must I tell you to stay away from my store?" The homeless man attempted to scramble away, but the manager was much faster. He seized the man by his frayed coat and pushed him forcefully to the ground. "If I ever see you back here, I'll call the cops," the manager warned, emphasizing it with a kick to the man's side. What was happening in front of Henry sparked something deep inside of him. Terrified, he looked up, where moments earlier he was in a city alley. Suddenly he was back in Afghanistan, in the midst of the chaos and madness of war. The city sounds faded and were replaced by the rattle of gunfire and the screams of his brothers. Henry's legs buckled beneath him and he fell to the filthy pavement, short panting gasps filling him as the flashback swallowed him whole. He could taste the salty smear of sweat on his lips and smell the acrid reek of gunpowder, and feel the sun of the desert beating down upon him. The commotion got the manager's attention, but the other homeless man scampered off. He turned, his eyes on Henry. "Another one," he muttered, stomping over to Henry, who lay twitching on the ground. "What is this? A rat convention?" The manager yanked Henry now to his feet, taking hold of his baggy, tattered garment. "Get the fuck out here, all of you," he thundered and pushed Henry roughly, sending him stumbling backward. The push was so forceful that Henry's already ragged shirt near ripped, revealing the contour of his bony chest to the warmth of the afternoon breeze. Henry, struggling to regain his balance, still caught in the present moment, and when he'd been with the war, heard through it the manager's parting words. "Damn homeless, you're like sewer rats. More of you every month and you just keep coming back, no matter how many times I tell you to get lost." Henry was left alone, in the alley, that manager's voice trailing off into the store. Gradually, reality started reasserting itself. The echoes of war receded, replaced by the familiar urban symphony of traffic and distant conversations. But the terror and adrenaline from the apparition remained, leaving Henry shaken and disoriented. His torn shirt fluttering in the breeze, and his stomach still painfully empty, Henry stumbled out of the alley. He did not know where he was going or have any plan other than to put miles between him and the image of his latest humiliation. Alone in the heartless streets of 1950s London, Henry wandered through the city streets, eventually finding himself at a liquor store, the familiar glow of neon beckoning from the back of a strip mall. The bottles in the window beckoned to him, with promises of relief from the physical and emotional pain that had surrounded him. For a second, Henry faltered. He knew all too well where the path of alcohol had led him in the past. It had been nothing good. It had cost him his family, his home, his dignity. But at this moment of desperation, as the shudders of his PTSD episode raged still through his system, the temptation was too great. Henry opened the liquor store door with a resigned sigh. The bell above the door chimed, and his presence was announced. The man at the counter looked up, his bored indifference shifting to weary suspicion as he noted Henry's bedraggled state. Henry shuffled toward the cooler, eyes glancing the rows of bottles before landing on the cheapest beer they had. He picked up one bottle, the glass cool on his calloused palm, and walked to the counter. The clerk glared at Henry, one hand poised on the hidden alarm button below the counter. "That'll be $3," he said gruffly as Henry set the bottle on the counter. Henry rummaged in his pocket and pulled out the last of his spare coins. "These were made for food," said a tiny voice at the back of his mind, but the promise of a quick escape from the onslaught of painful memories and current struggles, was too strong to deny. Henry's hands shook slightly as he counted out the coins. Whether it was coming down from the high hunger or the after effects of panic, he couldn't say. The clerk's impatient sigh as Henry stumbled over the money only deepened his mortification. Can you open it for me, please?" Henry asked quietly, sliding the coins across the counter. His arthritic fingers, swollen from the collapse earlier, would struggle to twist off the bottle cap. The clerk rolled his eyes, but complied, twisting the cap off in a snap. He shoved the open bottle back at Henry without a word. "Thanks," Henry said, taking the bottle without waiting for an answer. He whirled around and raced out of the store, the bell ringing a final time as the door slammed shut on Timmy's face. Outside, Henry lifted the bottle to his mouth and chugged desperately. The cheap beer was warm and bitter, but he barely noticed. He all but ignored the clump of the drinking, that the alcohol was a trap, and the bits of time flattened to a dull pulse, negating reality, the promise of forgetting, even if just for a little. Henry drank as he walked, step by step closer, to the oblivion he craved with each swallow. By the time he had downed almost half the bottle, an old familiar heat started radiating through his body. The jagged edges of reality began to smudge, the unrelenting pain in his joints and his heart starting to dissolve, easing. Henry's feet found their way to a bench in front of a restaurant. The scent of food lingering inside the establishment sent bolts of pain through his empty belly, reminding him just how hungry he was. But the alcohol was working, making it easier to forget the gnawing emptiness. Sinking down onto the bench, Henry let out a long breath. The world around him felt like it was fading in and out, like the sounds of the city were being muffled as if underwater. It wasn't peace, not really, but it was the closest Henry had been to it in quite a long time. He downed the bottle and reclined on the bench. As the alcohol continued to course through his system, Henry's eyelids began to droop. The constant watchfulness required to survive on the streets, a perpetual eye open for danger or opportunity, began to fade. Without intentionally setting out to do so, Henry found himself floating toward sleep, curling his body in on itself for comfort. The nearly empty beer bottle draped haphazardly from his fingers, ready to tumble at a moment's notice, but Henry didn't care. As consciousness began to fade, he embraced the oncoming darkness. In sleep, at least, he could flee the harsh realities of his waking life. Just before he fell all the way asleep, he had a fleeting thought. He was aware that he shouldn't be sleeping here, that if he were seen, someone from the restaurant would probably chase him away, but the exhaustion, hunger, and alcohol made it impossible to act on this knowledge. The moment sleep overtook him, a gruff voice snatched him back to consciousness, just as he thought it might. No, not again. A man who appeared to be the restaurant owner or manager had come out, his face an expression of exasperation. "You makes all the trouble, you homeless people. We have serious investors coming today. You can't sleep here. Move now." Too tired and too drunk to protest, Henry just nodded and got up. Loomis got his few belongings, the cardboard sign, the nearly empty bottle, and shuffled away from the restaurant. He managed only a few meters before his legs gave way, collapsing to the ground with his back against a nearby wall. Henry sighed as he drained his beer to the bottom and sat up straight. After throwing the empty bottle into a nearby trash bin, he lay down on the cement, using his cardboard sign as a makeshift pillow. A fine mixture of alcohol and utter exhaustion ultimately sent Henry into an instant slumber. As Henry finally passed into sleep, the sounds of the city carried on about him. Passers-by rushed by, some throwing curious or disgusted glances at the disheveled figure sprawled in the street, others purposely looking the other way. For many, Henry was just another part of the city's landscape of decay, as unexceptional as a scrap of paper on the sidewalk. Henry, in a drunken stupor, stared at the ceiling in a daze of a dream. He was back in Afghanistan again, the reassuring heft of his rifle in his hands and the presence of his brothers in arms surrounding him. Here in this dream he was strong again, his frame propelled by an ageless body, untouched by the ravages of time and hardship. In the next moment he was transported, caught in a gunfight, ducking for cover behind a decaying wall, adrenaline pounding through his veins. Gunfire rang out all around him. He lifted his rifle, finger on the trigger, prepared to fire back. But when he pulled the trigger, rather than the crack of gunfire, he heard a car horn. The jarring sound pulled Henry back to consciousness. He blinked quickly, too dazed by the jarring shift from war-scarred Afghanistan to a urban street. The honking went on, persistent and annoying. Henry came to in the same position he had fallen asleep in, spread eagle atop the bench top, sore and stiff. Henry groaned softly as he sat up. He rubbed his eyes, wishing he could wipe away the thick fog of sleep and the last remnants of booze from his mind. As his eyesight sharpened, he saw 2 luxury cars pull up to the curb at his bench. They were shiny new cars, polished to reflect the afternoon light. Henry saw as the doors opened and 3 men in rich business suits stepped out. They gave off a sense of wealth and importance that made Henry painfully conscious of his own scruffy appearance. 2 of them brushed past Henry without even glancing his way, their chatter unfazed and their path untouched by the piece of urban landscape resting there on the sidewalk. But the 3rd man, dressed in an emerald blue vest, lingered. His hand went to his pocket, and Henry's heart leapt with both hope and shame when the man extracted a wallet. He hated relying on the charity of strangers, but his empty stomach and the lingering after-effects of his hangover were stronger than his pride. The man in the suit pulled out some crisp dollar bills and extended them toward Henry. "Here," he said, his tone neutral. "Take this. Get yourself something to eat." Henry extended trembling hands to take the money. "Thank you, sir," his voice rasped from sleep and disuse. He glanced up, meaning to thank her more elaborately, but the words froze in his throat at the sight of his benefactor's eyes. The suited man tensed, his eyes fixed upon Henry's face. There was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Anticipation. Confusion. Henry couldn't be sure what the man was anticipating. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice suddenly wavering. "I didn't think that you were, never mind." Before Henry could speak, one of the other men said, "Hey man, you coming? We will be late for the meeting." The man appeared to come out of his daze. "Yes, coming." He turned back to Henry, but there was a strange expression on his face. "Have a nice day," he said quickly and rushed to catch up with his companions. He had seen the 3 men in question walk towards the restaurant, his brain wondering what they were up to. Why had the man stared at him like that? And why did those eyes feel so familiar? As the men walked into the restaurant, Henry was able to hear bits of their chatter. "Waste of money? These people are all the same. He'll probably spend it on alcohol. Right? Donating to them is a waste of time. If you want to give, invest in something credible like this restaurant. It at least gives you a return." Henry felt a mix of shame and resignation. He couldn't dispute what they said was true. Hadn't he just done that? He had just done that with the money he would have spent on alcohol instead of food. When he looked down at the bills in his hand, Henry was not only surprised but delighted to see 3 crisp $5 notes. The paper felt nearly alien on his calloused skin, so accustomed to handling filthy coins and crumpled single dollars. For just a moment, he let himself dream of what he could do with this unexpected windfall. Food was the first thing that popped into my head. Real food, not something you find in a dumpster or day-old food from a shelter. He longed for the pizza restaurant a few blocks away. 2 slices would fill his stomach now and have one to save for tomorrow. He would even have leftover change for the next time. As Henry sat at the patio table trying to figure out how to enjoy this sudden gift, he got the sense that something big had just happened. That man's look. It was as if he had seen a ghost. Henry shook his head, as if to clear the thoughts, and slowly pushed himself up to his feet, his body protesting the motion, joints creaking, muscles aching from spending the night on the hard bench. But the prospect of a real meal gave him a jolt of energy he hadn't experienced in some time. And with a final look at the restaurant where the businessmen had gone inside, Henry walked away down the street, tightly holding the crisp bills, and knowing for now that sometimes all it takes is some kindness to brighten someone up. Henry was hungry, and his stomach was growling as he walked over to the pizza vendor. The mouth-watering scent of bubbling cheese and fresh dough had his stomach growling. He hadn't had an honest meal in so long, and the thought of hot, honest food almost made him cry. As Henry approached the shop, he saw that a short line was forming before the counter. He fell in line, attempting to ignore how people ahead of him inched away from him, some covering their noses with their clothing, some stealing wary glances over their shoulders. Henry could smell his own appearance as well. Months on the street and limited access to decent hygiene facilities would take their toll. He slumped his shoulders, clenched his body as small and unflicting as possible, as he waited his turn. The line progressed barely as the minutes passed. The hunger and concern from Henry grew stronger. "Wish I could do that." He heard whispered comments from people near him, and his outsider status burned. At last, Henry made it to the front of the line. He opened his mouth to order, but before he could even get a sound out, there was the sound of commotion behind him. "Excuse me," a woman's high voice squealed. "I cannot take this smell anymore. It's ruining my appetite." The server behind the counter glanced up, his eyes narrowing when they fell on Henry. "Hey, homeless guy," he shouted, his voice nasty and irritated. "You're disturbing my customers. Get out of here." Henry felt the shame flush up his face. He wanted to tell them, to pull out the crisp bills from his pocket and demonstrate he was a paying customer like everyone else. But when he turned to do so, he found himself staring directly at the woman who had complained. She looked him up and down, her nose wrinkling in disgust. "You have lice in your beard," she said to him, her voice dripping with revulsion as she pointed. "I can see them crawling from where I'm at." The murmurs erupted around Henry, the line members adjusting and muttering in a way that was palpable. Henry increasingly felt that the atmosphere was turning hostile. He knew from experience that such situations could escalate suddenly. Henry left the line with a heavy heart. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his eyes trained on the ground. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause a problem." Henry looked back at the pizza oven, the sight of the flames, the click, click, click of the gas igniting, click, 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 which brought his flash of memory. All of a sudden, he wasn't in a pizza shop anymore, but back in a war zone. The tick-tick-ticking of the oven's ignition became the ominous countdown of a bomb. Henry was hit by such a strong wave of nausea, his body suddenly and viscerally responding to all the sudden traumatic memories flooding in. He staggered from the pizzeria, hunger forgotten in the wake of the new wave of hurt and terror. He walked away from the bleak storefront, his feet moving without direction, and his mind still stumbling through the wreckage of memory and shame. That led him back to the liquor store, where a neon light seemed to beckon him in his trauma. A part of him recognized this was wrong, that he was sliding back into the self-destructive pattern that had led him to this moment. But the pain had to be numbed. I had to escape the relentless onslaught of memories and rejection. Shaky, Henry opened the liquor store door. The same clerk stood behind the counter, his face a study of recognition and resignation. Henry walked up to the counter, shame and desperation fighting for dominance inside him. I need, he started, his voice barely audible. The clerk sighed and slipped his arm behind the cheap bottles on the lower shelf. "How many?" he asked, his voice flat and uninterested. "3," Henry answered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He took out the crisp bills, the ones that were meant to buy him food and hope. And now the foam would be traded for temporary oblivion. It was a rapid, silent transaction. Henry exchanged 2 crisp $5 bills and received 3 bottles. "Can you open one for me?" he asked, his voice small and defeated. The clerk obliged without a word, twisting off the cap and sliding the opened bottle across the counter. Henry with it, gulping down a long, desperate swig before even departing the store. As he stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun appeared to mock his fall. He held his bottles tight, already feeling that familiar warmth of alcohol sifting in. Left with nowhere else to go, Henry was making his way back to where he had laid his head beforehand. He left the cardboard sign behind, its pathetic marker of his dominion in this unforgiving urban jungle. As he walked up, Henry noticed the restaurant door had opened. The three businessmen from before came out laughing and hugging one another. Henry froze, suddenly acutely aware he held bottles in his hands. It was noticed by the men. Their conversation tailed off. Henry noticed a flash of recognition dart across the face of the man who had come up to him earlier, soon tailed by a wave of disappointment and regret. "See?" one of the other men said, pointing at Henry. "We said he spent your money on those bottles. They're all the same." The man in the blue vest didn't answer, but Henry read the regret in his eyes. And there was something more, too, a probing gaze that made Henry feel as if he were being tested under a microscope. An unfathomable gap, so close yet so far away, once again stretched between us as the moment lingered suspended in time. And just like that, as quickly as it began when it was over, the other two businessmen jumped in their SUV, waving goodbye to their friend and telling him to think about their investment proposal. The bachelor hesitated, still watching Henry. Then he shook his head slightly and went to his own luxury, SUV. As the cars drove away, Henry remained on the sidewalk. The bottles in his hands had never felt heavier. His day had begun with a glimmer of hope, a momentary spark of possibility that this could be the day, the very day that he might escape the trap of poverty and addiction that seemed to bind him in chains. But now, with the afternoon sun descending, lower in the sky, he was back exactly where he had left off, with nothing in his hand and only the familiar comfort of the alcohol on his side for the rest of the day's unending solitary hours. But as the luxury SUVs vanished around the corner, Henry realized the consequences of his choices were crushing him. The alcohol was working its way through his system, bringing with it a familiar numbing warmth. But it couldn't completely sponge away the jagged edge of self-loathing and regret that sliced through his awareness. The sky above shifted, the great dark clouds looming, rain threatening at any moment. A ripping wind mixing with the leftover heat of the afternoon started to gust, penetrating Henry's threadbare clothes and causing him to shiver despite beads of sweat on his brow. Even though the bazan started to flow in his blood, the bypass, rushing through him, the cold that had taken refuge inside his bones refused to resolve. It was like a house guest who does not want to leave. The heavy summer rain was falling and it was closing in on him. Henry's gaze fell upon the bench beside the restaurant that he had worked in the past. A canopy covering the restaurant extended just far enough to provide some cover from the rain that was about to begin. The manager had already warned that they couldn't sleep in the hostel, but in his alcohol-addled state, Henry had forgotten. All his mind could think of was to find safe, dry place and lie his tired body. Henry stumbled slowly toward the bench. He collapsed onto it with a groan, his joints creaking in protest. Everything around him had become slightly hazy, the alcohol causing the very air around him becoming mildly distorted. Henry's mind wandered as he lay there. He considered the man and the look of recognition and disappointment in his eyes. He reminded Henry of someone. It was some light touch, some angle. But Henry couldn't find out who. But trying to fix on the memory was like trying to catch smoke. The more he reached for it, the more it slipped away. The first drops of rain started to fall and tap against the roof over Henry's head. The sound was somehow soothing, pulling him deeper into the half-orbs of consciousness. He held one of the bottles against his chest as one would with a teddy bear, seeking solace in its presence. Henry held his head up, the alcohol and weariness of the night beckoning him to sleep. He hadn't dreamed this time, or if he had, the dreams weren't shaped, were shadow, fading and left nothing on his waking mind. How long he had slept he had no way of knowing when a loud voice and a piercing whistle brought him back to consciousness. Henry jerked awake, the throbbing of his heart a loud percussion as he attempted to interpret his environment. The restaurant owner loomed over him, his face flushed with rage. He was flanked by two officers, one of whom had just dropped a whistle from his lips. "Wake up!" the restaurateur yelled, frustration and disgust audible in his voice. "How many times do I have to tell you people not to come around here?" Henry groaned into his crusty hands and sat up too fast, and the world swirled around him. "Please," he whispered, his voice a mere croak. "Please." The noise one of the officers stepped forward. An annoyed Aisha probably wouldn't have been surprised if he said, you act like an animal or something?" "We've been trying to wake you for a few minutes, sir," the officer said. The whistle represented a last resort. Henry shouted as the restaurant owner waved his arms at the officers. "And this is why," he said. "This is what I'm talking about. These homeless people are destroying my business. I've got important investors, and I can't have this eyesore driving them away." Henry's foggy brain clung to the word investors. He recalled the men with the looks they had given him earlier. So had they been looking into buying this restaurant before? Henry didn't have time to fully process this thought before he felt powerful hands gripping his arms. The policemen were dragging him to his feet, the cold metal of handcuffs around his wrists. "No, please," Henry pleaded, the reality of the situation at last penetrating through his haze of alcohol. "I'll go. I promise I won't come back. Just please don't take me in." But his pleas went unheeded. They started to guide him to the patrol car that was waiting. Their grip not so tight it was painful, but not so loose it could be resort to violence. As they approached the police car, Henry's legs felt like lead, every step a monumental challenge. Henry's desperation grew. He realized that being in jail for a night, even as it offered him a roof over his head, would make his problems worse. He would lose what little he had, and the stigma of an arrest would make it far more difficult to seek help or work in the future. Just when one of the officers was about to open the car door, a black SUV I knew all too well cruised up to the curb. The door opened, and the man in the greenish-blue vest stepped out, face a mask of concerned determination. "Stop, please," the man said, his voice dripping with authority. The restaurant owner transformed with the sight of him. The anger dissipated into a simper. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice respectful all of a sudden, "I didn't think you'd be coming back so soon. Is there a conflict with our agreement?" The man shook his head, his gaze riveted on Henry. No problem. I would like to speak to this man if that is okay." The restaurant owner appeared confused but nodded vigorously. Of course. The officers exchanged a look but obeyed, taking the handcuffs off Henry's wrists. "Fine," one of them said, turning to Henry. "You can leave, but I strongly recommend you get a shelter or somewhere else to sleep. We hope not to see you back here again. Understood?" Henry nodded speechlessly, trying to wrap his head around the abrupt turn of events. He rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had been and winced at the tenderness of his skin. The man thanked the officers and the restaurant owner and then focused entirely on Henry. "Do you have a second to talk?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Maybe we can sit on that bench over there." The restaurant owner hesitated for an instant, then, in an effort to please the well-heeled venture capitalist, nodded. "Of course. You don't want the rain to ruin your suit." The man gave a grateful nod. "Just for a few minutes. We won't be long." As the man walked Henry back to the bench, the restaurant owner yelled out, "Mr. Miller, if you need anything at all, just let me know. I'll be inside." Mr. Miller nodded absently. His attention was riveted on Henry. As they sat, Henry was overwhelmed with tenderness in the young man's face. It had been ages since anyone had looked at him like that. Like he was a person, worth looking at and caring about. "I have a very important question for you," the man said, his voice low but a little hesitant. Henry nodded, encouraging him to carry on. "What did you mean by that sign? Used to be someone?" He pointed to the sign now trodden into the sidewalk, its cardboard soaked and crumpled. Henry squirmed on the bench, the weight of the man's question now between them. He was not expecting such a straightforward question, certainly not from someone who seemed to live a life miles away from him. Henry hesitated for a moment before clearing his throat. He finished speaking in a deep, gravelly voice. "I served this country," he said, each word coming slowly as if it took him great struggle to express. "Risked my life in the army. That's all, nothing special today anymore, I guess. Henry was torn between the urge to bolt and the urge to stay and know more. The latter won out as the young man leaned in closer, his eyes wild with apparent curiosity, and something deeper, something Henry could not identify. "You were in the army?" he inquired, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I ask what's your name?" Henry hesitated again, hardly accustomed to such personal questions from strangers. But there was something in the man's demeanor that helped to put him at ease. "Henry," he replied. "Henry Miller." The man's breath caught audibly at the sound of his name. He cleared his throat, his hands twitching in his lap. "Henry Miller," he said again, as if trying the name on for size. I have another question, if you don't mind. Did you have a son?" The question landed on Henry like a punch. Memories long submerged rose to the surface. A little boy's laughter, bedtime stories, a little hand in his. He nodded, slow, his voice stuck on a lump in his throat. Now the man sounded like he was shaking. "Do you remember his name?" Henry closed his eyes and let himself remember fully, for the first time in years. "Yes," he whispered. "His name was Frederick. I used to call him Fred." That silence afterwards. Deafening. Henry looked up to see the man staring at him, tears falling down his face. Before Henry had the chance to protest, the man had wrapped him in a tight embrace. "Dad?" The young man gasped between sobs. "It's me. I'm Frederick Miller. I'm your son." Henry to sit frozen, his mind in knots trying to make sense of what was happening. It couldn't be true. But his son was little, not this successful businessman. And yet such eyes. He knew such eyes. As Fred withdrew from the embrace, Henry examined his face more closely. The years had changed him, of course, but now that he was looking for it, Henry could see traces of the little boy he remembered on this man's face. Fred dabbed at his eyes, attempting to get hold of himself. "I've been searching for you for years," he said. "When Mom left, and you too, I never gave up hope that I'd find you. But I never thought it would be this way." Henry shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "It can't be," he muttered. Fred had reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it he drew a crinkly photograph. "Look," he said, extending it to Henry. Henry accepted the photo with trembling hands. It featured a much younger version of himself grinning widely with a small boy on his shoulders. The image of it drove a new wave of memories crashing over him. "I remember this day," Henry said quietly, running his finger across the image. "We went to the park. My son wanted to feed the ducks, but he was scared to get that close to the water." Fred nodded, a misty smile on his lips. "You kept me company the whole time," he added. "You made me feel safe." Henry felt a rush of shame wash through him as the reality of what had just happened sunk in. Look at his son. Successful, kind, and what had happened to his father. A starving drunk, a drain on society. Fred glanced at Judith, with empathy in his eyes. "Dad," he said softly, "I know it won't be easy. I know it's been hell for you. But please stay here with me. Let me help you. We can provide the therapy you need, for the PTSD, for the alcohol addiction. You have earned an opportunity to regroup, rebound after all that you gave for our country and for the family. It's the least I can do." Henry could feel a lump in his throat forming. It was more than he could have ever dreamed, more than he felt he deserved. Yet Fred's eyes were so filled with love and often the same level of determination that I couldn't ever say no. "Okay," Henry whispered so low his voice was barely a sound. "Okay, son, I'll stay. But you've been teaching me how to live in this life in your world. I'm an old man now and I'm slow to learn." Fred's entire face lit up with a huge grin and he enveloped Henry in a bear hug. As Henry hugged back, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope for a better future. Hope for healing. Hope for a chance to restore the relationship with his son he thought he had lost forever. As they pulled apart, each wiping tears from his eyes, A loud growl came from Henry's stomach. Fred laughed, releasing some of the tense feelings that hovered in the air. "You are starving, I'm sure," said Fred. "Why don't I fix us something to eat? Do you remember that tomato soup and omelet that you used to make for me when I was little? I think I can recreate it." Henry was surprised with wide eyes. "You remember that?" Fred nodded, smiling fondly. "Of course. It was my favorite meal. It used to be you called it the perfect comfort food, as if there were no situation it wouldn't soothe." Fred rose to walk to the kitchen, and Henry felt a rush of nostalgia creep over him. He could nearly taste the creamy tomato soup and chubby omelet, could nearly feel the warmth of their old kitchen while preparing food for his little boy. "Dad, do you need any help?" Fred called as he passed through the door. Henry paused, in equal parts excitement to help and uncertainty about fitting into this room. Fred turned his head back and a smile appeared on his face. "Sure, Dad. Come on, taste the soup. Will you? See if it needs anything." Henry moved into the kitchen to stand near the stove, breathless with anticipation and dread. Fred gave him a tiny tasting spoon, and Henry cautiously drank from the deep red liquid. The taste burst on his tongue, and along with it came a flood of memories. Cozy evenings in their old kitchen, Fred as a small boy in a stool watching his father stir the pot, the comfort of a warm meal after a long day, the simple pleasure of cooking for someone you love.